Heart of the Wild West by Simon Cross. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Creek, Colorado, as Elizabeth Stanford descended from the stagecoach. Her legs trembled slightly after the long journey, and she gripped her carpetbag tightly, trying to maintain her composure despite her exhaustion. The year was 1875, and she had traveled all the way from Boston to take up a position as the town's new schoolteacher. The driver handed down her trunk, and Elizabeth found herself standing alone, surrounded by the unfamiliar sights and sounds of the western town. Wood plank sidewalks lined the street, connecting an assortment of buildings that seemed rather crude compared to Boston's refined architecture. The air carried the scent of pine from the nearby mountains, mixed with dust and the earthy smell of horses. "Miss Stanford?" A feminine voice called out, and Elizabeth turned to see a plump, middle-aged woman hurrying toward her. "I'm Mrs. Henderson, wife of the town doctor. We've been so looking forward to your arrival." Before Elizabeth could respond, the thundering of hooves drew her attention. A group of riders approached at a swift pace, and townspeople scattered to clear their path. At their head rode a man who commanded attention without effort, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. His black hat sat low over his eyes, but Elizabeth caught a glimpse of their intense blue color as he passed. "That's Sheriff Matthew Drake," Miss Henderson explained, noting Elizabeth's interest. "He keeps the peace around here, though some say he's as wild as the outlaws he hunts." Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm at being caught staring. "I'm sure the sheriff is quite competent at his job," she said primly, straightening her skirts. Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled. "Oh, he's that and more. Come along now, dear. Let's get you settled at the boarding house." Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth threw herself into her new role, determined to prove that a city-bred woman could succeed in the West. Her dozen students, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, proved eager to learn despite their varying levels of education. She found herself adapting to the rhythm of Western life, even as she maintained her Eastern standards of propriety. She encountered Sheriff Drake frequently in the small town, and each meeting left her more intrigued. He touched his hat politely whenever they passed, but rarely spoke more than a few words. Yet she often felt his gaze following her, and sometimes caught him watching her schoolhouse from across the street. One autumn afternoon, as Elizabeth was dismissing her students, shots rang out in the street. She hurried to gather the children back inside, her heart pounding. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Drake and his deputies exchanging gunfire with 3 rough-looking men who had apparently tried to rob the bank. "Stay down, children," she ordered, keeping her voice steady despite her fear. She moved among them, ensuring they remained below the windows, speaking softly to calm their fears. The gunfire ceased, followed by shouts and the sound of running horses. Elizabeth waited several minutes before cautiously approaching the window. Sheriff Drake stood in the street, checking on townspeople who had taken cover. His shirt sleeve was torn and stained with blood. Without thinking, Elizabeth rushed outside. "Sheriff, you're hurt." He turned, surprise flickering across his features. "It's nothing, Miss Stanford. Just a graze." "Nonsense. You need that cleaned and bandaged properly." She gestured toward the schoolhouse. "I keep medical supplies for the children's scrapes. Please, let me help." Something in her tone must have convinced him, for he followed her inside. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she cleaned the wound, but her touch remained gentle. "You were very brave out there," she said softly. "Just doing my job." His voice was equally quiet. "You showed considerable courage yourself protecting those children." She looked up, meeting his eyes, and felt the air between them change. "I suppose we all have our duties," she murmured. "Yes, but some go beyond duty." His calloused hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "Like you coming out to tend to a wounded lawman. I couldn't very well leave you bleeding in the street." Elizabeth tried to sound practical, but her voice wavered. "No, I suppose you couldn't. It's not in your nature to ignore someone in need." His thumb traced small circles on her wrist. "Just as it's not in mine to ignore a woman who's captured my attention since the day she stepped down from that stage." Elizabeth's breath caught. "Sheriff Drake." "Matthew," he corrected. "I think we're past formalities, don't you?" She smiled slightly. "Matthew. I'm Elizabeth." "Elizabeth," he repeated, as if tasting the name. "Would you allow me to call on you properly? Perhaps Sunday after church?" "I'd like that very much." Their courtship progressed with proper decorum, but underneath ran a current of growing passion. Matthew proved to be not only strong and capable but also intelligent and well-read, surprising Elizabeth with his knowledge of literature and history. She found herself sharing her dreams of expanding the school, and he supported her vision wholeheartedly. As winter approached, Matthew began building a house on the outskirts of town, though he never explicitly stated his intentions. Elizabeth watched its progress with growing anticipation, even as she told herself not to assume too much. The matter came to a head one crisp December evening. Matthew had escorted Elizabeth on a sleigh ride, and they stopped to watch the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. "This is beautiful," Elizabeth breathed, gazing at the vista. "Not half as beautiful as you." Matthew turned to face her, taking her gloved hands in his. "Elizabeth, I'm not a man of fancy words or Eastern refinement. But I know what I want, and what I want is to build a life with you. You've brought something to this town to me that I never knew was missing." He drew a small box from his coat. "Will you marry me?" Tears sparkled in Elizabeth's eyes as she looked at the simple gold ring. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Their wedding took place in the spring, when wildflowers dotted the mountainsides. The entire town turned out to celebrate, and even Elizabeth's parents traveled from Boston for the occasion, having been won over by Matthew's letters and Elizabeth's obvious happiness. The school continued to thrive under Elizabeth's guidance, now operating from a new building Matthew had helped construct. She maintained her position even after marriage, with her husband's full support, breaking with tradition but setting an example for her female students about following their dreams. Years later, Elizabeth would often think back to that first day in Silver Creek, when she had arrived full of uncertainty about her place in this wild territory. She had found not only her place but also her purpose and her heart's desire. The West had changed her, but she had changed it too, bringing education and refinement while embracing its strength and freedom. As she watched Matthew teaching their young son to ride, she smiled, knowing that love could bridge any divide, be it between East and West, civilization and frontier, or duty and desire. In the end, it was about finding someone who made you better while loving you exactly as you were. And in the heart of the Wild West, Elizabeth and Matthew had found exactly that.